Imagine yourself on a narrow footbridge with no handrail. Imagine yourself in a boat with no rudder, or out on a cloudy night in the wilderness with no moon or stars. Imagine a smartphone with no map app, or a large stone gathering moss, a murky river, mud season. Sometimes it's hard to get from here to there. Sometimes we don't know where we're going. We are in between, neither here nor there. Afloat, adrift, unmoored, or stuck in the mud, lost in the wilderness. This kind of physical or spiritual state can be scary, uncomfortable, even painful. We might feel out of sync, unproductive, even ashamed. It's hard to answer a well-meaning question in this state like, "How are you?" when we're in between, neither here nor there, drifting, stuck, lost. How do we hold ourselves and each other when we are in between, in liminal space, undergoing some kind of inarticulate transformation? Religious traditions hold resources. There is the Buddhist saying, "No mud, no lotus," meaning that the beautiful lotus flower will not emerge, grow, and blossom unless rooted and arising from the muck and mud that nourishes it. The fruits of meditation practice cannot be realized without letting that murkiness and confusion of life arise in our minds. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert praying. Muhammad withdrew to a cave to meditate. Natasha Che wrote, "All the mystics who came before you, be it Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, had periods of disappearance into the void, the empty spots on the timeline of their life when it seemed they had suddenly dropped off the edge of the planet. Nobody knew where they were and what they were doing. They went alone. They went within, relinquishing their old limited identity and becoming something more expanded, powerful, and closer to their truer self." There is a Sufi wisdom tale from the mystic branch of the Islamic tradition called The Stream and the Desert. Maybe you've heard this one. It goes like this: a stream, far from its course in the far-off mountains, passed through every kind and description of countryside, and then at last reached the sands of the desert. Just as it had crossed every other barrier, the stream tried to cross this one, but found that as fast as it ran into the sand, its waters disappeared. It was convinced, however, that its destiny was to cross this desert, and yet there was no way. Then a hidden voice coming from the desert itself whispered, "The wind crosses the desert, and so can the stream." The stream objected that it was dashing itself against the sand and only getting absorbed. The wind could fly, and this was why it could cross a desert. The voice of the desert replied, "By hurtling in your own accustomed way, you cannot get across. You will either disappear or become a marsh. But that will take a long time. You must allow the wind to carry you over to your destination by allowing yourself to be absorbed in the wind." Well, this idea was not acceptable to the stream, After all, it had never been absorbed before. It did not want to lose its individuality. And once having lost it, how was one to know that it could ever be regained? The wind, said the sand, performs this function. It takes up water, carries it over the desert, and then lets it fall again. Falling as rain, the water becomes something new. How can I know this is true? The stream replied. I don't know. But the desert said, it happens, and if you do not believe it, you cannot become more than a quagmire, and even that could take many, many years. And it's certainly not the same as a stream. But can I not remain the same stream that I am today? It begged. No, the whisper of the desert said, you cannot in either case remain so. Your essential part is carried away and forms a stream again. When it heard this, certain echoes began to arise in the thoughts of the stream. Dimly, it remembered a state in which it, or some part of it, had been held in the arms of the wind. It also remembered, or did it, that this was real too. It was the real thing, although it was not the obvious thing to do. So the stream raised its vapor into the welcoming arms of the wind, which gently and easily bore it upwards and along, letting it fall softly as soon as they reached the roof of a mountain, many, many miles away, to eventually become a stream again. And because it had its doubts, the stream was able to remember and record more strongly in its mind the details of the experience and say, yes, yes, now I believe, and I have learned my true identity. I wonder, do we ever talk to each other about this part of a transformational process? The dissolving, the dissolution of who we thought we were, who we used to be, who we were sure we had to be. That frightening and necessary release, the letting go, the evaporation, the loss of our usual form, our individuality, and the not knowing what comes next. The good news is that this part of a transformation process is normal and even to be expected. If we name it, we can signal to each other what's happening. William Bridges calls it the neutral zone. In his classic book, Transitions, Bridges wrote, in other times and places, the person in transition left the village and went out into an unfamiliar stretch of forest or desert. There, the person would remain for a time, removed from the old connections, bereft of the old identities, and stripped of the old reality. It was a place without a name, an empty space in the world and the lifetime within which a new sense of self could gestate. One of the difficulties of being in transition in the modern world is that we've lost our appreciation for this gap in the continuity of life. For us, emptiness represents only the absence of something. So we try to find ways of replacing the missing elements as quickly as possible. In this view, he continues, transition is kind of a street crossing procedure. One would be a fool to stay out there in the center of the road any longer than was necessary. So once you step off the curb, move on to the other side as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't sit down on the center line to think things over. No wonder we have so much difficulty with our transitions, he writes. This view makes no sense out of the pain of endings. where all that we can imagine is that our distress is a sign we should not have crossed the street in the first place. It also makes no sense out of the feeling of lostness that we are likely to experience, or that feeling that the emptiness seems to stretch on forever. Wait a minute, we want to object. There is another side to this street, isn't there? Bridges calls this empty place the neutral zone. He claims that every transition begins with an ending and ends with a beginning, with an important empty or fallow time in between. The neutral zone, he says, is a time of inner reorientation that the modern world pays the least attention to. Treating ourselves like appliances that can be unplugged and plugged in again at will, we've forgotten the importance of fallow time and winter and rests in music. My dear friend, who is a retired chaplain, used to say to her staff and patients during a deep conversation, "Let's put a comma there. Let's put a comma there." She was good at recognizing when a group or an individual needed to pause and let things gestate. She normalized it, made it okay to wait and not push for results. The award-winning 2020 film Nomadland, starring Frances McDormand, offers us the endless terrain of the neutral zone. She plays a widow in her 60s who loses everything in the Great Recession, embarks on a journey through the American West, living as a van-dwelling modern-day nomad. If you've seen the movie, you'll recognize the vast stretches of empty space in which she dwells as she travels, seemingly getting nowhere. She wears her grief like a skin, like a garment, driving away from endings, yet not knowing where she'll find a new beginning. Her van like a comma, giving her space where she can be carried by that vehicle through unimaginable transformation. Known for its cinematic patience, watching Nomadland gives us practice in just being with someone in a neutral zone. It's been a few years since I watched it, but I don't recall any sense of resolution at the end of the film. Just a long, rootless waiting and wandering, stumbling upon moments of joy and healing and even community. Sometimes living in the neutral zone happens to us because of a huge transition out of our control, like losing our financial resources, getting hit by a car, receiving a serious diagnosis, suffering gun violence, the death of a loved one. Sometimes the neutral zone happens because we choose transformation. We file for divorce, adopt a child, get a new job or find a new career, move to another city or out of state. But sometimes we can cultivate familiarity with the neutral zone even when we are not living there. Sometimes we might want to. Karen Herring claims in her book, Trusting Change, that being able to pause is a necessary skill for personal and communal transformation. She says, our ability to linger and dwell in between, to perch in the unknown long enough for new possibilities to emerge, is an important skill in these times. She writes, pausing in the in-between is about stopping, ceasing our efforts to control and determine future outcomes, breaking the forward momentum. A stoppage that is not final, but fertile. Herring emphasizes that spiritual practices can help us develop the skill, and the practice doesn't have to be impressive. Buddhist writer Pema Chodron says we can engage these practices in the middle of our daily lives. She writes, pausing creates a momentary contrast between being completely self-absorbed and being awake and present. You just stop for a few seconds. Breathe deeply and move on. You don't want to make it into a project. You just pause and allow there to be a gap in whatever you're doing. Christian writer Richard Rohr says listening is a practice that serves us well during in-between times. He writes, transformation more often happens not when something new begins, but when something old falls apart. The pain of something old falling apart, the chaos, invites the soul to listen at a deeper level. I'm pausing for just a moment. Chodron and Rohr do not recommend striving when in the neutral zone of transformation. So I wonder, how do we hold each other when we are betwixt and between? I believe if we name it, we can hold each other in it. So if one of you says to me, Dina, I'm in the neutral zone, I'll have some idea of what you mean. I can stop and pause with you, listen with you for what your soul is trying to say. And you can do that for each other too. You already do that with each other. For example, at memorial services and their aftermath, that long road of grieving. We've also had lots of practice with liminal time and space in communal transformation here at First Church. When something ended and something new had not yet begun. We held space for each other for 2 years in between senior ministers. We held space for each other during what seemed an endless pandemic exile. Waiting for a vaccine, waiting to gather in person, waiting for conditions to allow the most vulnerable among us to be included. In August of 2020, I took an online class with organizational consultant Susan Beaumont called Leading in a Liminal Season. She said individuals and communities have different degrees of liminal tolerance, our ability to tolerate the anxiety of the unknown, our ability to stay with ambiguity through a neutral zone. She taught us to use tools identified by Otto Scharmer, senior lecturer at MIT, which can be used anytime we find ourselves in a process of deep transformation. Scharmer claims we must cultivate an open mind, which is the capacity to suspend habitual judgment, an open heart, which is the capacity to shift perspectives, and an open will, the capacity to let go of preconceived outcomes. Suspend, shift, let go. How do we do this? Scharmer says we confront the barriers of our inner binding voices, the voice of judgment, the voice of cynicism, the voice of fear. Beaumont says once we identify our own binding voices, we go sit by a stream or a river or imagine ourselves there. Let those three voices arise, release them into the water, and let the current carry them downstream. I know that nationally and internationally we are in an urgent time of striving and advocating, and it's very important to do that because the stakes are very high. Yet I believe to sustain our efforts and to bring everyone along communally, we also need to know how to travel through the empty spaces where it seems like nothing is happening. We need to be able to hold each other there. When we find ourselves or each other in that place of in-between, may we pause and breathe and affirm that the river flows even when we cannot hear its voice. May it be so.